Hello, I'm Senator Tim Kennedy. I'm so proud and honored to play a part in the unveiling of the Great Famine Voices New York State. I want to recognize all of the partners for putting together such a monumental occasion where we remember and we memorialize and recognize all of those brave souls that came before us and went through such treachery to not only cross the great sea, the Atlantic Ocean, to a new life in the United States of America, landing here in New York, but that challenged all of the odds to make it and ultimately established our ancestry and our lineage here all throughout the great state of New York and all throughout the United States of America and the global community. Here in New York State, of course, so many people not only landed in the city of New York, but of course up and down the east coast of the United States and into Canada, whether it was Boston Harbor or Philadelphia, down into Baltimore and Savannah, New Orleans, of course, and up into Canada, Montreal, and Toronto. So many Irish, after they landed, made their way to the great state of New York and then worked their way up or to the Erie Canal, starting down at, of course, New York Harbor. The harbor being created because of the Erie Canal, the place to do business, not only here in New York State, but across the country, the port of call. Of course, up the Hudson to Albany, great Irish roots in Albany, past Utica, New York, to Syracuse, to Rochester, and to the great city of Buffalo. They came all along the Erie Canal, working, trading goods, setting up businesses, setting up their families, and doing that blue-collar work and establishing footprints for all of our families and communities to prosper in over many generations. So out here in Buffalo, we are so proud of our Irish history and lineage, and we celebrate it quite often to play a role in this day and this occasion as we celebrate those brave people. Again, I'm extremely honored. Congratulations to all that made this happen.
Eileen and I made our first trip to Ireland in the late 1980s. I was on my way to Oxford to participate in an Oxford debate, and she said she'd come with me on the condition we went to Ireland. When we got there, and we were only there for 4 days, but each day was a kind of a discovery for her. Seeing villages named after families that she knew, seeing shops named after her paternal and maternal grandparents' names. It was a place that she could identify with and feel at home. People looked like her and looked like the kids she went to school with, the same way I felt when we first went to Lebanon. And she saw me go through that and didn't have that for herself, but when she got to Ireland, that was the experience she had. And so she became deeply invested in the place and began her process of discovery, self-discovery, but also discovery about the island and its people. And we went back every other year, sometimes every year. And it was always a great experience. I think one of the issues that grabbed her the most was the famine. It was something she hadn't known about. One time we found ourselves in the museum of the famine, and she kept saying over again, why didn't we learn this? Why didn't they teach us this? Why didn't we know this? This must be what happened to my people. And the more she read, the more upset she became about the issue. And I've mentioned before about her sense of justice. It's why I got involved in Palestinian work, why she supported work in civil rights or work in anti-war activity or reforming the Catholic Church. These were issues she cared about. When there was injustice, she became upset and wanted to see what could we do about it. The famine wasn't just the starving of people, it was the fact that Ireland was producing food and people weren't allowed to eat what they produced. It was that sense of almost willful neglect of people that enraged her. And I know the story that Irish Americans are sometimes less willing to forgive. When we went to Ireland after the Good Friday Accords and people were like, we're ready to move beyond, she was not. When the borders were open and one day after we're coming back from Donegal, we all of a sudden passed through the north because that's where GPS took us, and she saw British flags. She was like upset about it. But yeah, I mean, it became a very important part of her self-definition.
So I'm Elizabeth Stack. I'm the Executive Director of the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York. And I'm going to speak to you today about the Irish roots, of New York, of the entire state. So few people probably know that actually the Irish have been coming, since the start. It wasn't just a great hunger exodus. In fact, Albany was founded practically by Thomas Dongan, who he gave the charter, which, interesting enough, he was a Catholic landowner in Ireland, a soldier, and he made a proviso in Albany's charter and in New York's charter for particularly freedom of religion, a lot of civil liberties. And so you can kind of argue, people say, the Dutch had something to do with that kind of openness of New York and the melting pot sort of history, because the Dutch wanted to trade and so they were open to all comers. But I think probably Thomas Dongan's experience as a Catholic landowner in British occupied Ireland, had something to do with that too, that he was very conscious of his Catholic roots. And then a little bit later on, as the canal, in particular the Erie Canal, opens, so it's not just Irish people working on the canal as the kind of diggers. They are also, DeWitt Clinton has Irish ancestry, some of the engineers had Irish ancestry, so the Irish were involved at all levels of the canal. And this brings them up and out of this region. Then, of course, it's the 1820s and 30s. New York is now the centre of the world, really, because they're bringing all of the goods, along the canal down to New York to import or export. And so Irish people come to Rochester, to Syracuse, to Buffalo. They've followed the canal up anyway, and some of them settle on farms. But a great many start to come in the 1850s and 60s, of course, after the Great Hunger, to work in factories. And so, our own Troy, New York, is known as the Collar City. Cohoes, another big factory town. This whole region was a lumber kind of district. And so, during the famine, people sometimes came in through Canada, and this means they come downriver, maybe as far as Albany, maybe as far as New York City. So I think that's kind of the story of the Irish in New York, that there's many different levels of them. They are predominantly Catholic. They have that leg up because most of them speak English. And then what I also think is fascinating about the Irish in New York especially is the constant transatlantic ties with home.
Hello, my name is Jack McEnany, and I'm as Albany and as Irish as you can get in this part of the world. And most people would know me because I wrote the history book on Albany. And I was very active in political life, including my last 20 years in the state capitol as a state assemblyman. I've been to the Famine Museum in Roscommon, in Strokestown on 3 different occasions. But with the creation of the Erie Canal, which was a genius of an Anglo-Irish, and DeWitt Clinton, by the way, who was the governor that took the plane and eventually took the credit for the Erie Canal, you could break through the Appalachians. You were north of the Appalachians, which end in southern Albany County, and it's blocks again with the Adirondacks coming down, but you have that Mohawk Valley, and the Erie Canal running through that and going all the way to the Great Lakes opened up the nation. Baltimore and Philadelphia and Boston were the most important place to come. Once that Erie Canal went, you could watch the city of New York become the focal point for immigrants, because you could come here. Some people still had the idea that they might go back to the land, though most of them stayed urban, as we know. You could come to New York. You take a steamboat, another new invention from the 19th century, come up to New York, get on a packet with the Erie Canal, and you could build all those cities across New York State, which were just villages at the time. Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, and finally the Queen of the Lakes. So my father's family were the McEnanys, and they came from County Monaghan. And their history of the famine, which they never talked about. They would say we came because of the potato famine. They all said potato. No one was classy and said Angor or even the Great Hunger. And then they'd talk about Ireland generically. They wouldn't even mention County Monaghan. The McEnanys were from Carrickmacross. And that was a case of chain migration. 2 of them were married in 1848 and apparently got on the boat as quickly as they could. Every time I think of the people who are on the border in Mexico. I used to live in Colombia in South America, by the way, in the American Peace Corps. So I'm somewhat familiar. And I look at people, and if they're Irish, I get ashamed of them and I tell them, do you know where your people were? Did you ever go and read a census? It's not that hard to do. And you're in the poorhouse, and you're in the orphanage, and you're in all kinds of areas with single moms, that the husbands died, and so on and so forth. And then move it forward for 3 generations. You've got the judges, the president of the university, the head of the banks, and so on. The American dream works. But for the famine Irish, it took longer.
No matter what reason you came from Ireland, and this to me is for all immigrants, whatever reason you left your own country, you remember those reasons, and as Americans, we try to ensure that we never have those reasons repeated here. So whether it's persecution for religion or famine or need for work or whatever, you appreciate what's here. You keep the memory alive of the old country so that you never forget why you came. And this to me applies to all nationalities.
So the Irish American Heritage Museum was founded in 1986, and just last year we moved to our new location here at Quackenbush Square. A much larger location, but of course we moved a month before COVID. And so while we're delighted to have the new space, we still are renovating, but part of the renovations, we're so thrilled to have been able to build this replica thatched cottage and a replica tenement apartment with the aid of a Department of Foreign Affairs Immigrant Support Program grant. So the cottage, I suppose, is to try and show, make it come alive for people, to show what Irish people left. About 25% of the population lived in 4th-class housing. This is kind of an amalgam, we try to go for the one-room look. It is thatched. We have the open hearth with the crane, and so it's just to bring a little flavour of the old Irish, the Sugaun chair, the shillelagh, you know, the St. Bridget's cross. We have details here. Some things were donated by our members, but others we had to build or source. And so, you know, it is a glimpse into the very simple life that people, Irish peasants, you know, in particular, lived in. And I think it just makes history come alive. You know, material culture or tangible objects is always nicer to look at than reading, you know, something on a wall. And so I think the cottage is very special for people. We have a little stone wall outside and our sheep. And, you know, many of our members and visitors have had visits like this in Ireland, you know, where they've seen the old homestead or heard stories about the cottage. And so we're absolutely delighted to be able to recreate that here in Albany.
Hello, my name is Dan Spicer. As my mom would say, I'm a Yank. I'm the youngest of my generation of cousins, first generation Irish. My mom and dad were both born and raised in Tralee, County Kerry, Ireland, and they came out at separate times. They immigrated to America. It was always a great drive and opportunity that my mother and father said was their reason for coming to America. More opportunities than were in Ireland, and they wanted a better life for their children and for their children's children. I think back on some of my tough days, and I think about what they went through in order to come to America. The many stories that she told, and how they missed home and longed for home. A little emotional, but I remember those stories vividly.
So as part of telling the story of the Irish in America, of course, we had the cottage and the famine and what they left. And now this section is a tenement apartment that many of the Irish immigrants would have lived in cities like Boston and New York. The interior of this is actually from the Albany Architectural Warehouse, the foundation, you know, so it is historically accurate. We kind of based it around 1865. So the story that we're trying to tell maybe is of the son who left the cottage and has come now to America. He's living in what became a tenement. So these of course were originally one family homes that were subdivided, and he more than likely would have enlisted in the Civil War. So this apartment, you know, has a gorgeous stove that we have on loan from the State Museum. There's no indoor plumbing, so this behind me, the kitchen, like she would have had to go downstairs to the yard with a bucket to get water. There is gas lighting. And, you know, I think the story that we're trying to tell is that of a little bit of upward mobility. Too often, you know, people that lived in tenements and immigrants in general were seen as dirty, and, you know, they were living in overcrowded conditions, in a lot of poverty. But sometimes the poverty is not of their making, or the conditions in the home is not of their making. So, as I say, these were one family homes, particularly in a city like New York, you know, built in bad environments, like the 5 Points was built on a mill pond, you know, that was drained badly. So the landlords are not keeping up their apartments and their property. But the immigrants, as we saw when they did an archaeological dig on 5 Points, were actually collecting things, you know, so you would buy nice china, or you would, you know, maybe pick up furniture, disused furniture from your employer if you were a maid, or from the street. And so there is this element of them trying to better themselves, but also to maintain their culture. So we have some of the religious icons that they would have known from home. So here at the museum, you know, we've been in operation for 35 years. And it's a tenuous link. Each generation is a generation out. And so, you know, while we have members who have very strong memories of their parents or grandparents speaking with, as they say, a brogue, or, you know, they having very close ties to family in Ireland, their children are sometimes not as involved in keeping the culture and traditions alive. So that's what we try to do here at the museum. And, you know, now that we have this new larger space, we're able to highlight the contributions of the Irish in revolutionary America, in the war, in the military, in culture, in literature and sport, in politics, in religion and education, and in labour. And so the museum is kind of story driven and biographically driven, and having a tangible example of someone's home, I think, is one of the nicer ways to learn that story.
As many folks know about the history of our area, the Erie Canal was started back in 1817. And the start of it was in Rome, New York, probably about 15 miles west of here. And of course, when they started building that canal, they went both ways in digging it. And then, they went towards the city of Utica. And of course, the Irish played a significant part in the building of that canal. So there are many, many Irish settled here as a result. One of the first founding fathers of the city of Utica was John Devereux. He was from County Wexford, Ireland. And he was a businessman, and he was highly supportive of the Irish community here that was here already. And he was responsible for promoting and building some of the churches that are in the area now. This cultural center is built on the site of one of those churches, the first Irish church built in Utica, New York, was St. Patrick's Church. Unfortunately, it burned down quite a number of years ago in the late 1800s, and the next church to be built would have been built, actually is built diagonally across the road here, and that's St. Patrick's and St. Joseph's Church. So when they were looking for a site to build this cultural center on, they said this plot of land was available, and it's where the old St. Patrick's Church had sat at one time. And many of the foundation stones were recovered during the excavation of the site. In fact, they did recover the cornerstone of that church, and it sits out on the front lawn of our cultural center.
This is a story about two brothers, Nicholas and Stephen Pendergast. And their parents were Nicholas and Bridget Whitley. And there were other children that were born to them, but this is really the story of two brothers. I'm going to quote from these letters that were found in my grandmother's attic. And there were 57 letters between the two brothers. On the famine, he writes twice about the famine in these letters. And in May of 1846, he writes, "I'm sorry to hear by the newspapers of the rot against the potatoes in Ireland, which must cause great distress amongst the poor. I hope it has not reached your neighborhood. In case it has, give all of the assistance in your power to relieve this distress, as it is a duty incumbent upon all to whom God has been graciously bountiful to relieve the distress of humanity. And Providence will protect those with charity around." Then he writes in May of 1848, 2 years later, "I regret exceedingly that the potato crop has failed to the extent you described it." So Stephen must have had some crops of potatoes, and they failed. And it appears that there is some calamity hanging over this unfortunate country. Now, the reason that Nicholas is so intent about having his brother come to America was not because of the famine, although it contributed to Stephen's ultimate decision. It's because he's very intent on education and educating Stephen's children. Nicholas was never married and never had any children. Stephen had 9 children, and he took it upon himself to make sure that they were all very well educated.
You know, my father's family started leaving Ireland in the 1850s and 40s, and probably when it was an emergency, but therein lies the habit. It started, and you know, my mother's family is an example of where it was continuing on. My grandparents came to America on my mother's side in the 20s to make money and planning to go back to Ireland because it was sort of a thing. You know, you would come to America. It was almost a given. When my mother was growing up, it was almost known that when she was 18, she was going to be returning to Ireland. And to the point where now many of my cousins who still are in Ireland are sad because they've lost kind of a generation. They have no cousins themselves in Ireland. We're all in America. But to get to my mother's family, my grandparents came to America in the 20s, where they met in New York and married. My grandfather came through Canada. And in 1929, let's see, that's when they married. 1931, my mother was born. And by 1933, they were headed back to Ireland. My grandfather was ill. My great-grandfather was ill, and they took over the farm. When they got back to Ireland, they were kind of well off. My grandfather had been a sand hog in New York, worked on the Holland Tunnel, and lost a piece of his finger. We always talk about that. My grandmother, she worked at the Brown Hotel in New Hampshire, and in the winters she would work in New York. And that's probably where they met. And but back in Ireland, they had some money, and they had a Victrola, which nobody had at the time. My grandmother was a doula there. She was sort of a wise woman. Everyone kind of came to her. I guess it's a success story, truthfully. You know, I'd like to just thank my Aunt Betty for a lot of what she did. I remember as a kid, she'd come up to us and she'd say, "You're descended from kings and queens," she would say. And she was right.
We moved to Utica, and then that's where all my other brothers and sisters were born. And my father's business became a good business. Both of them lived the American dream, I think, you know. And when they looked back on their poverty, you know, I think that was a blessing for them, because it made them stronger and want to get things that they didn't have in Ireland. You know, they wanted for their children what they didn't have. And the one thing, the greatest blessing they ever gave us was our Catholic faith. And I think that's what got them through some tragedy. They had 2 daughters, and a grandchild died, and they got through it. I know that being the oldest at times, we had fried egg sandwiches on a Wednesday night, and my mother would make a joke of it that we're having breakfast for dinner. And as I look back on that, I realize that's when we lived on Miller Street, when we were just all little kids under 10, and there was no money for meat, you know. But he kept on plugging. He kept on working hard. And he finally ended up buying a plot of land in Whitesboro, New York. And he took his wife, my mother Mary, to see the site. And there were only 2 houses on that street. There was a farm down the road. And she said, "Johnny, I'll tell you something right now." She says, "I was brought up on a farm. I don't intend to go back to a farm." And anyways, they told us a little bit too about a lot of the history of our family and the Irish potato famine. Now, this happened in 1845, and nobody really knows the true number of how many people died, you know. But that wasn't the tragedy, just the 1.5 million estimate that they think died because of the potato famine, you know. And they also lost about 2 million people that immigrated to the United States of America. Around my father's town, around Lepp in Cork, I think they called them the Green Mouths. And the soldiers would ride by with horse-pulled buggies or freight buggies and filled with barley and grain. And they would look at these people on the side of the road with green all around their mouth because they had been eating grass, you know. And I think to myself, where was the humanity there, you know? And the one beautiful thing I think about the Irish is when somebody tells them they can't, that's when they'll try all the more to make sure they can. You know, they never give up. I look back at my Irish aunts and uncles. I've been back to Ireland. One of the most beautiful days I've ever had in Ireland was when I saw my father's grandmother and grandfather, or his mother and father's grave. I didn't know them. I had only seen them in pictures, you know, and I wanted to say a prayer over their grave and to thank them for my father, who I thought was, to this day, the greatest man I ever knew, you know.
In the summer of 1954, when he's 22, these 2 young women come to the show, One is Diana Coop from Utica, and her friend Joan Kellenberg from Long Island. And basically, it's a long story, but it's love at first sight. And it's really romantic and beautiful. And in the following June of 1955, my mother and father are married in the Killarney Cathedral on June 30th. It's the first wedding in Ireland of a Yank to an Irishman, apparently, and so it is in all the newspapers at that time. In 1986, he becomes actually a naturalized citizen. He chooses that year because there's a lot of attention brought to a ceremony that they're going to have because it's the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. So I guess there's a lot of articles written about, immigrants and citizenship. But he decides he will become a citizen, and so their friends have a little parade up Springgate Street in front of the house. They have Dad sit in a lawn chair in the dark. They have someone dressed as the Statue of Liberty. They have garbage can lids to make a lot of noise. They sing, they have sparklers, and they have a parade just for my father. And I know that man is a man with no regrets, happy, proud to be here and to have the life he has. He has never looked back. In 2015, my husband Steve and I and my sister Roisin and daughter take a trip to Killarney again with my parents, Diane and Jim. We stay in a rented house on New Street, and we see all the sites again, and they are close enough to visit the cathedral where they are married for Mass and walk in the National Park. And a cousin of mine, John Looney, a couple nights before we're leaving on a Saturday, says, I want to bring Jim up to a session. So we go up the street to the Arbutus Hotel, and my father is 83 now. He has lost all the hearing in one ear and has a hearing aid in his other ear. My cousin seats him near the musicians next to the accordion player who's known to my cousin. And after about an hour, this accordion player, he passes his accordion to my dad and asks, would you give us a tune? So Dad takes it, and he fumbles a little, and then he gets his notes, and he's off playing 2-3 tunes. And it is a clear and beautiful sound. And the people in that bar on that Saturday night stop. They stop talking, they listen, there's a hush. It's really incredible to me because I've always heard him play, but I don't know that he's very good or not. But apparently, it's beautiful. And then when he's finished, he hands the accordion back to the gentleman, and we hear the man say, where have ye been? And then, will you be here tomorrow?
My grandmother, Mary Catherine Cooney Heslin, was born February 23rd, 1898. She was born in Clawhannen-Shee near Quilty in County Clare. She was one of 7 siblings to Sinan and Bridget Walsh Cooney. And her parents did not think there was much of a future for the children in Ireland, so they sent them to America 1 or 2 at a time. And my grandmother in 1916 was the next one to be sent over. The night before she left, they had an American wake for her, which was a large gathering of family, friends, and neighbors who came to wish her well and send her off, singing, dancing, playing of instruments, things like that. The next morning, a gentleman came to pick her up to take her to the train station, and she burst into tears. At that point, she realized that she would never see her parents or her younger sister, Nora, or her younger brother, Sinan, again.
Hi, I'm Derek Pratt, the museum educator at the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse, New York. Now, the Erie Canal was a 363-mile-long waterway connecting Albany on the Hudson River, and therefore the Atlantic Ocean, to Buffalo on Lake Erie, so all of the Great Lakes. This was the first major transportation route between those two enormous bodies of water, and it was transformative for the United States. And it has had an inextricable link with the Irish for most of its history. The Erie Canal, following its completion in 1825, was incredibly successful though, and New York State decided to expand it from 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep to 70 feet wide and 7 feet deep. That project, by that point in the mid-1830s, required even more labor, and by that point in time, Irish labor was almost exclusively used on canals in the northeastern United States. This also happens to be right about the time when the Famine Irish begin coming over, and they were able to find plenty of work helping New York dig its new enlarged canal. But not just that, they also found quite a bit of work working on the canals on a boat like this one as either steersmen, mule drivers, cooks, and even owning their own boats as captains. This boat would not have just been where they worked, it would have also been where they would have lived. These boats operated 24/7. They also found quite a bit of opportunity along the banks of the canal, working in the many factories and farms that spring up along the route and contributing greatly to their local economies. Here in Syracuse, for instance, salt was our major industry, boiling salt. This was a demanding task, and many of the Irish found jobs in the salt boiling fields. And many would form their own communities nearby, like Syracuse's Tipperary Hill on the city's west side, which had both salt and other industries in the area. And even myself, I know directly the impact of the Irish on this region. My grandmother, the descendant of Irish immigrants, ended up settling just a little east of here, near the Erie Canal in Chittenango, New York. So the Irish presence here in central New York has been felt for over 200 years and is still felt today.
Hello, my name is Kate Costello-Sullivan. I am the director and founder of the Irish Literature Program and a professor of modern Irish literature at Moyne College in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse has a very rich Irish history. There's an area called Tipperary Hill, which is kind of famous for its upside-down traffic light that puts the green on top. I personally am not from Syracuse. I'm from Rockaway, New Jersey. I am fourth generation Irish American. And so what I guess I would contribute to this conversation is the three different ways that I've come to understand Irishness. The first is as a fourth generation Irish American. It was all Clancy brothers, green, very sort of stereotypical Irish American understanding of Irishness, not a lot of depth there. When I married someone who was second generation Irish, and it changed my entire understanding of an Irish American relationship to Irishness because they have relatives there. There was just a lot more historical understanding, perhaps, than I had been privy to. And then the third, of course, is as an academic. I think, you know, growing up in American schools, a lot of us would say, I'm Irish. When I entered an Irish graduate program, of course, and I met Irish people, they would say, you're not Irish, you're Irish American. I think it's really, really important, and this is something that my program tries to do, that Irish Americans come to understand not just the broad strokes and the sort of immigrant inheritance of Irishness that happens through immigration, but also the real history and the culture and the literature. And I think to be a hyphenated Irish American or American anything else, having that contact and knowledge and depth is really important. So I'm grateful to have the program here. We founded it in 2006. We've enjoyed wonderful support from the community and from alums, and I'm grateful every day for my academic connections in Irish studies.
Hello, I'm Jane Elizabeth Brown, and we're at Moyne College, where I work, and I've been really pleased to work with Professor Kate Costello-Sullivan in helping to establish the Eileen Patricia McMahon Irish Lecture Series here. I am a first-generation American. My father, Jeremiah Joseph Brown, was born on a little island off the coast of Skull, Long Island, and I always like to say that I come from a long line of strong women, and it's only been as I've fleshed out my grandmother's story that I've learned just how strong she really was. My father was the youngest of 4 children, and it was only recently that we learned that there was a 4th child who must have died quite young. But when my grandmother was pregnant with my father, her husband died. He actually committed suicide. Again, a fact that I've only recently discovered. She was on Long Island, realized she couldn't support her family of 3 children, and so left her 3 children on the island with relatives and emigrated to New York City. The story is that when she arrived in New York Harbor, and this would have been around 1920, that she was told that they had reached the quota for Irish for that particular year. So somehow she made her way to Canada and actually lived in Canada for a short while, working in a convent, and eventually was able to make her way back to New York City. When she left her children in Ireland, she had told her relatives that when she had enough money to pay for the passage, she would send for the children. And it actually, my father was 14, so 14 years later, before she had the funds to be able to pay for the transport for my father and his older sister. My father didn't really talk much about his life in Ireland except to say that the countryside was so beautiful, and every Friday night my father put on his stack of Irish records this high, and the Irish music stayed on from Friday night until Sunday night. So he really instilled in us a great love of Irish culture, and my niece, I think, was so enamored with my father's love of Ireland that she actually did her 4 years of study at Trinity College Dublin. So the Irish roots, are very strong, and my family's love of that Irish heritage is still very strong. And I have a piece of Irish jewelry that says, "My journey, my life," in Irish, and I always, think of my grandmother and my father as I wear this.
It began with, it was my grandmother's great-grandfather and his wife and family who left Ireland. And they had either 3 or 4 children, the oldest being my grandmother's grandfather, who was 14 years old. They left Ireland altogether. They arrived in Baltimore, Maryland as 4 orphans, the parents having died on the way. The 2 or 3, there was 1 girl and either 1 or 2 younger brothers were taken into an orphanage in Baltimore. My grandmother's grandfather was 14 years old, and if you were 14 years old, you were a man and you were to take care of yourself. I don't know how it happened that they came to upstate New York, but in upstate New York, my relative, my Will Traynor was his name, Will Traynor. Will Traynor did well enough that he got a farm and raised his family. One evening, a man came to the door and asked to talk to Will Traynor. He said he was Will Trainor's brother. Of course he was invited in. He didn't want to come in. He asked them to send Will Trainor out to him, and the two men talked through the evening on the porch. And then Will Trainor's brother went away and was never seen by the family again. But part of that family then moved to Salve, New York. And a man came to Salve, New York and went into a boarding house, and he lived in the boarding house for about 6 months, and then he died. And he left basically a sort of a will, I guess, asking that the Trainor family be informed of who he was and of his death, and that was the younger brother. And it seems very clear to me that this was a very strong silence. He had lived in Salve for 6 months, had moved to Salve apparently because the family was there, and had not got in touch with them. And I picture him watching his brother's grandchildren in the park and getting some kind of solace from the fact that his brother's grandchildren were thriving in Salve, New York. And that's all the family history I know about connected with the famine.
We're standing in Buffalo's first ward, which is a residential and commercial neighborhood. It's the oldest Irish settlement in Buffalo. In the 1840s, you had famine immigrants that were landing in Buffalo looking for work, and Buffalo's grain trade was exploding. In 1842, Joseph Dart invented the first steam-powered grain elevator, and grain elevators sprung up along the Buffalo River, and you had these Irish men who were looking for work and worked in the hulls of ships, worked in the grain elevators, worked milling the grain. So this was a great source of income. And then they also started to build the neighborhood where we're standing. By the 1860s, 1870s, you had thousands of Irish men and women in this neighborhood. By the 1880s, there were about 10,000 Irish, either first or second generation, living in this part of Buffalo. My paternal great-great-grandfather, who has the same name as me, although the spelling was B-O-H-A-N-E, he landed in Buffalo in about 1868 and built his home in about 1874 in this neighborhood. He was an illiterate grain scooper who came from Skibbereen. He was born in about 1849, right at the end of the famine in one of the worst hit parts of Ireland, in the southwest of Ireland. And then he came, married his wife, Mary Driscoll, my great-great-grandmother. So the Driscolls were in this neighborhood, the Roches, the Coughlins. Most of my paternal ancestors landed here, raised their families, were here for a couple of generations, and then moved on to South Buffalo. To this day, this is still looked at, as well as South Buffalo, as the iconic Irish neighborhoods. There is an annual St. Patrick's Day parade, the Shamrock Run, that happens in this neighborhood each year, and it's just a great rallying place for people from all over Western New York and even across the country that have Irish roots that started right here in the First Ward.
Hi, I'm Mary Hennigan, Chairman of the Buffalo Irish Center, located here in Buffalo, New York, on the south side of the city. We're Western New York's Irish American Heritage Center, and we've served the community for over 52 years now. The center was founded by Irish American immigrants as a place where they could mingle and network as they all arrived from Ireland looking for a better position for their families as they traveled throughout the world. You know, the face of Ireland is stamped across the country and across the world, and many of those people suffered through years of a forced famine that brought them to the four corners of the world, and many of them and their descendants then came to the United States, and many to Buffalo. At that time it was a great place for the boats and for the railroad terminals, so it really harbored a large percentage of an Irish American population. My father was born in Kilmahill, County Clare, and came over here in 1918. He was one of 13 children. His father was a shoemaker, so that was a relatively stable profession at that time, but again, my father felt it was the thing for him to do. So he came over here, got married here in South Buffalo at St. Teresa's Church, and had 3 children. My husband was born in County Mayo, in Kilmaine, County Mayo. He was one of 11 children, and he was born on a farm. And but I believe 2 emigrated either to England or America. My husband was the only one who arrived here in America and stayed, and I was fortunate enough to have met and married him. We have a mural on the side of the wall called Misha Era. And Misha Era speaks to the arrival of the immigrants here in Western New York, and it starts with the famine. And you'll see the sketch of a mother and her child and the potatoes, a forced starvation of an entire generation of people. Something that should never have been allowed to happen, and things that should not be allowed to happen today. So the mural talks about that, and then it shows how the Irish grew as they came into Western New York, and they were the laborer jobs, they were the bricklayers, they were the carpenters, but then all of a sudden they became the firemen, they became the policemen, they became the politicians. They serve in all areas of the community now, and they have a very positive footprint across the Western New York area. We're very proud of the mural. We're very proud that our area is called the Irish Heritage District. We love our Gaelic road signs and our Emigrant garden that speaks to the heart of the people who left Ireland to call our area home.
So today we're standing at the site of the western terminus of the Erie Canal, which was opened in 1825. This is the reason that Buffalo became one of the top 10 cities in the United States in the 19th century. It connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, and Buffalo was the gateway for tens of thousands of people because of being at the western end of the terminus, and also the site of goods that had to be unloaded and loaded and processed, and that needed thousands and thousands of workers. So it opened in 1825. There was a trickle of Irish immigrants pre-famine that settled here in Buffalo. However, as the famine years came, tens of thousands of Irish men and women came and settled here. And we're in what was called the Canal District. It was also called the Infected District because this was an area of the poorest of the poor, very poor Irish immigrants who worked as saloon keepers, prostitutes, sailors, cooks. They did laundry work, etc. It's also the site of several famous Irish Americans from Buffalo, including Chauncey Olcott, who was the famous Irish tenor who wrote My Wild Irish Rose, as well as co-wrote When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. Also, Kitty O'Neill was the most famous Irish dancer of her day. She moved from this area to New York City and danced in the 1870s and 1880s in New York City. And then it also is the place where E.P. Christie and George Christie, who were both founders of the Christie Minstrels. It's kind of a dark chapter in Irish history, but they were sons of Irish immigrants who were very involved with minstrel shows and kind of forming that art form here in the United States.
Hi, I'm Kevin O'Brien. I'm here at the Buffalo Irish Center in South Buffalo, the Irish community. My family came to Buffalo in 1900. My grandfather came over from Ireland, and my family is still here today, and I'm proud to call my home is Buffalo. My grandfather came to Buffalo because about 50 years before the time, he had 2 aunts that left Ireland at the famine time. His grandfather had died in 1845, leaving his grandmother with 6 kids and had to make a living. And so his 2 aunts had come over here and started out. And they actually came through Buffalo first. They came through New York City and then down along the Erie Canal. And then Buffalo was a big exit out to the Western Reserve. And they took boats out along Lake Erie and out to Cleveland and Toledo and Detroit. And his sisters ended up in Iowa, where she met a man in 1857 from County Clare, another family from the hometown, where she married, named Tom Redden. And her other sister, Catherine, married a man named Tom Dowling, and they settled in Wisconsin, not far from her sister in Iowa. But my family came over here because of famine time. That was the start of my O'Brien family here in United States. They originally were from the west of Ireland in County Clare near the Atlantic Ocean in a parish called Kilmurray-Ebricken. And that was one of the areas that was severely devastated by the famine. The soil in County Clare is not the most fertile. It's very rocky. It's where all the beautiful stone walls are, and it's probably one of the best tourist spots in all of Ireland because of the beauty of the ocean and the stone walls.
Today we are at Buffalo's Irish Famine Memorial. It was erected in 1997 on the 150th anniversary of Black 47, and it is very close to where the Erie Canal came through Buffalo, which would have been a transport for tens of thousands of Irish men and women who either landed in Buffalo or disembarked from the canal and went on ships to the Midwest or further out to the western United States. So it's a very, very important site. So it's also fitting we're here at Buffalo's Irish Famine Memorial, very close to where thousands of destitute Irish men and women came, landed during and after the famine. Fortunately for them, the first Bishop of Buffalo was John Tenement, who was a son of Irish immigrants, and he invited the Sisters of Charity to come and open up institutions to help these desperate people. They opened up Buffalo's first hospital in 1848, and then several other institutions to take care of the Irish. And to put it in perspective, the Irish only ever made up about 18 to 20% of Buffalo's population, but they made up, at the time of the famine, over 60% of the people in the poorhouse, 40% of the people in the county jails, and 60% of the people in the insane asylum. So very, very desperate people. And we're all very grateful for the work of the Sisters of Charity, and then later the Mercy Sisters, who also came to minister to these people.
Out on the northwest at Penn Station, we struggled with luggage in the aisle. We went for the same seat together. That's when I first saw your smile. We were heading home for Christmas with a sprinkle of snow on the ground. You were heading north to Albany while I was Chicago bound. Two strangers in Poughkeepsie, and the snowstorm tempted fate. For you I was alone to Erie, for me you were alone to